Ben Houchen, great to see you here on the Planet Normal podcast. You are Teesside Mayor. You know the region really well, born and bred, proud northeasterner. How's the economy doing in the northeast under this Labour government?
I think it's difficult to tell. I mean, there's two parts to that question. So locally in Teesside, things locally are going pretty well. There's still a lot of investment coming in. We've been working on that for a lot of years now, 6, 7, 8 years. We've seen the employment rate since I was elected in 2017 go up 5.4% in the last 7 years compared to a national average of 0.1%. So I think locally people would tell you there are lots of really good things going on in the economy, jobs being created, some really interesting stuff, which I'm sure we'll talk about when it comes to kind of carbon capture, hydrogen, offshore wind. But then there's a slightly more macro conversation going on with people, which is the general state of the country economically, whether that's national insurance rises, the budget has caused a huge blow to people's confidences. And in particular, Teesside being the type of economy that it is, family businesses are really worried. And in particular, they're worried about the changes to things like the business property relief. And we obviously talk about a lot about farmers being asset rich and cash poor. You see a lot of that in Teesside as well. Some really successful businesses, asset rich, port businesses, for instance, cash poor, where they're saying they might have to sell their businesses. So there's a bit of a schizophrenia going on at Teesside at the minute. People feeling locally quite positive, but when you overlap that national kind of feeling at the moment and what's going on nationally, it's not so positive, to put it mildly.
The CBI Manufacturers Survey, and of course Teesside is nothing if it's not a manufacturing heartland, particularly dire at the moment. To what extent do you think manufacturers really are suffering at the moment, and what are the implications of that?
So they are suffering. They're suffering for two reasons largely. Firstly, and by far and away, I think the most significant factor is energy costs. Particularly in a place like Teesside, which is the second largest chemical and processing sector in the country behind the Humber, energy costs are everything. And actually, if you look at all of the official statistics, this isn't just about this government. This is a long-term decline over the last 4 or 5 years of the chemical sector contracting in the country by 38%. And when you think Teesside has the second largest cluster, that has a hugely disproportionate impact on a place like Teesside. More so as well because those jobs are really secure jobs, but also really well-paid jobs. I mean, the average wage in the Tees Valley is about £29,000 a year, compared to obviously the national average, which is about 36, I think. These people are on 60, 70, 80, 90, more than £100,000.
And that drives a lot of local business, doesn't it? The fact that there are quite well-paid people in the community.
Absolutely. The supply chains that come off the chemical sector, both directly in relation to providing services into the chemical sector, but indirectly, whether that's catering services, marketing, communications, professional services, the impact it is having is significant. But that's also why people still feel optimistic locally, because they can see a transition away from more traditional chemical and processing sectors, so other areas where these jobs are being fulfilled. So if you look at things like Net Zero Teesside, which will be the world's first industrial-scale carbon capture and storage facility, a £6 billion investment from BP, Equinor and Total as a consortium. That's 4,000 construction jobs. It's 1,200 jobs once it's up and running in 2028. People can see a transition that works for them, protects jobs, moves manufacturing so that we can be sustainable in the future. And so people are frustrated that there are some incredible businesses that are either closing or offshoring, but they're also feeling confident that the future is also a positive one locally in Teesside because of what we've been able to secure.
In your 7 years and counting as Teesside Mayor, you have really championed this whole net zero agenda in the sense that Teesside has become a place where investment is attracted to things, as you say, like carbon capture, like offshore wind. Teesside really is the jump-off point for North Sea wind energy, those initiatives. On the other hand, you'll know, as somebody who follows the manufacturing sector to your fingertips, that there is a lot of concern among trade unions. Look at what's happened at Grangemouth, one of our biggest chemical centres, refineries, closed down. The owner, Ineos, closing it down. Look at the impact of net zero on our car manufacturers, the so-called Z directives, the zero emission directives, really now putting strain on our car industry. You have been seen as a champion of net zero, Ben. To what extent do you think that some of those net zero policies, for all the benefits that they're bringing to Teesside in particular, are hollowing out our manufacturing base?
I think there's nuance to that. I'm a champion of these technologies because actually I'm a champion of investment in jobs. And as I go back to the chemical and processing point, to protect the existing 6,500 jobs we have in that sector, never mind creating new jobs, we have to decarbonise. Why do I say that? Because it's government policy, right? It was the policy under the Conservative government. It's doubling down, particularly with Ed Miliband in this government, as the mayor of the region in that type of which is very heavily reliant on those types of sectors. I have to do my job and make sure I protect inward investment and create jobs. So that's why I'm a big supporter of it. You know, if I was in a more national position and in a position of power, not that I am, would I take a different view? I think I would take a different view. And Grangemouth is a great example of that. So Grangemouth, they're losing hundreds and hundreds of jobs. Jim Ratcliffe and Ineos have already closed their operations in Teesside. They used to have some significant operations in Teesside, which was the canary in the coal mine. I mean, Ineos are an incredible industrial player in the UK. But it's not just about them closing it down. They're turning it into an import terminal. So actually what they're basically doing is losing all of the jobs in the UK, offshoring them all, and then still importing the product that we need into the UK that used to be made in the UK. And that's the bit of net zero, that's the bit of the transition that people, including myself and most people on the street, just cannot buy into. It's one thing having a transition, and there's a discussion to have about that, but doing it in a way that costs jobs, makes us poorer, and makes local communities like mine, which are poor in relation to the rest of the UK, is not something that's acceptable.
How about this zero emissions directive? We've talked about it on Planet Normal in the past, where now, unless car makers in the UK, you know, Teesside is a centre of UK car making, of course, not least with the Nissan factory. Unless they are selling 28% of their cars are fully electric, they get fined 15 grand per car that they make that pops that 28% target. Our rules on zero emissions for our car industry are more strict than the EU's rules. How do we get into this position? Wouldn't you reverse that?
Yeah, I would absolutely reverse that. Of course I would. But it demonstrates as well, signing up to a 2050 net zero target is one thing, but it leads to a culture and a sense of direction that the civil service then take on, and politicians take on as well, where all of a sudden they feel like they have to beat what is already a very ambitious target. So setting a 2030 target, been tweaked 2035, you know better than I do, Liam, there's some nuances to those rules, is one thing. But why, again, are you driving out industrial development, car manufacturing from the UK, when actually you could measure that over another 15 years and create a 30-year timeline? You know how important that is. Nissan don't just turn up on 1 month and say, okay, we're going to do the electric Qashqai in Sunderland. They don't do that. It takes about 7 years for Nissan as an organisation to go through their corporate structures, their pipelines, their manufacturing processes, to set up a new line at Sunderland to introduce a new model. So the idea that now in 2025 we can change this rule and have 2035 as the limit, that doesn't push manufacturers to do that, because that's what the government are trying to do. They're trying to push manufacturers in a direction. What it does, because the rest of the world are playing to slightly different rules, is it causes a company like Nissan to say, actually, should we even be in the UK? And we can invest our capital somewhere else, make the same, if not better, margins, and we're not having to deal with these cliff edges that we're seeing in the UK. Yes, the government want us to get there, but actually it's too much of a risk for a company like that. We're about to see, and it's a slightly different point, but it's the same point, the same thing in the boiler industry. The government have just implemented the same fine system to say, if boiler companies that produce gas boilers that go into pretty much 99% of our homes aren't selling, I think it's 5 or 6% of their product as heat pumps, they will be fined. What's that going to do? That doesn't necessarily mean that there's a transition to extremely expensive heat pumps. It probably means that some of these boiler manufacturers are going to retrench and move away from the UK market, making things more expensive and making it more difficult to be able to install boilers in our homes. So it's counterintuitive to what the government and the wider policy system is trying to produce.
Just going back to cars, it seems as a society directed largely, it strikes me, by the civil service, that electric vehicles are the only viable technology to replace hydrocarbons. Now, of course, you know, you're mayor of Teesside. There's lots of EV car making going on Teesside, but that notwithstanding, don't you think this is a blind alley to focus so relentlessly on one technology? How about hydrogen technology?
Well, I was going to say that
we've
we've talked about this, haven't we, at length separately, Liam, about the opportunity within the hydrogen economy, and that's not just in cars. That can be in large-scale construction. You know, you've got people like JCB producing hydrogen equipment that can go on to construction sites now and run on 100% hydrogen through hydrogen combustion
And the only
engines.
emission is water.
Literally, the only emission is water. I've got Cummins in Darlington, big American company, producing hydrogen combustion engines in Teesside, every single one of them is exported to the US because the UK government doesn't have a regulatory model to allow these engines onto the UK roads.
Yeah.
And what's bizarre, and it goes back to how has this been allowed to happen, fundamentally it's an issue of Sir Humphrey. Back in 2013, 2014, a decision was taken that we need to electrify our energy system. And so every decision that has been taken since has to reinforce that decision, even when the rules change, even when the facts change. That doesn't seem to me like good government. I think there's a huge space for hydrogen. Electricity, more generally, but certainly in vehicles, will play a role to some extent. But what we have is a government, both at a political level and a civil service level, that is trying to pick a winner. And what I say to government, I say, look, I'm a big hydrogen convert, so I'm not saying I'm right, but government has to develop a system that's more technology agnostic to allow the likes of hydrogen or other types of fuel to come to the fore. Whereas at the minute, government is trying to pick a winner. We know how that ends. It's not going to end well. And there's a huge cost to that, not just to the people that drive the cars, but to the energy system in general, which we've seen from the recent NESO report that was published by the Department of Net Zero. And the costs are eye-watering to get to net zero by 2030 to decarbonise our grid. And even then, the report itself even talks about needing to ration energy in people's homes to do so. That's no way to run a modern economy like the UK. An energy-poor economy is a poor country. And I think the tide is starting to turn, to be frank, and hopefully it will sooner rather than later.
So in a nutshell, how would you describe, notwithstanding that Teesside is a centre of EV car manufacturing, how would you decide the decision by Whitehall to focus so relentlessly on electric vehicles, pushing the industry towards electric vehicles apart from other technologies?
Well, I think it's madness for the government to be able to push EVs beyond all else. The country's not ready for it. The costs aren't there. It's going to make consumers poorer. It's going to drive people into transport poverty. It's going to ultimately push people out of work as well for not being able to afford a flexible way to be able to get around. Like I said, my worry is under this government, they are more hardline than even the Conservatives were. And the Conservatives were pretty wedded. I mean, we introduced the 2050 target.
Yeah.
So my worry is this is going to get worse before it gets better.
You mentioned Sir Humphrey there. Do you believe, Ben Houchen, in the idea of the deep state holding back economic progress in
I don't think I'd call it the deep
country?
state.
So, but you, as Teesside Mayor, you have had huge dealings with our regulatory bodies, our agencies. You've developed, rightly in my view, a reputation for being able to get things done, pushing through the bureaucracy. What's your sense of these arm's length bodies, these regulatory agencies? Because it strikes me they seem often to have faceless bureaucrats running them who are more powerful than elected politicians.
I mean, that's a very good point, Liam, and I'll use an example, but I will allow the minister to remain nameless. I had a meeting with a Secretary of State, actually under the previous government, under the Conservative government, where I had a pretty major issue with an arm's-length government body that was supposed to be under the control of that ministry, under that Secretary of State. And the Secretary of State said to me in an official meeting in front of civil servants that was minuted, whether this was minuted or not, I don't know, they said to me that it would be easier for them to introduce new legislation and change the law than it would be for them to tell the arm's length body what to do. I mean, when a country gets to a point where ministers and politicians are blamed for everything, but actually have very little power and little control over the arms of government that actually administer and impact our lives on a daily basis, we've gone too far. And I also think culturally, where you talk about independence, culturally it means that those bodies do not align to the will of the people, because we have a democratically elected government with a mandate to deliver X. And an arm's-length government body would say to you, well, I don't have to deliver X because that's not my remit. And I don't care about democracy. I don't care about your mandate. I have terms of reference that I need.
And if ministers push, in the end, they'll say, we're independent.
This is the point.
Back off.
And this is
back
the default.
Off or we're going to start leaking to the papers
Exactly.
and making you look stupid.
And the default of all of these arm's-length government bodies is ultimately they talk about political independence as if it's a good thing. They say, oh, well, we're separate from politics, and that's a good thing because we can make independent decisions. But actually what it means is we often see perverse decisions. We look at what Border Force are doing. Look at what's on migration. Look at what the Environment Agency does. We're talking about a government wants to go for growth, and you've got the Environment Agency in Natural England building £100 million tunnels. So unless you bring together the cultural need for a democratically elected government to deliver on its mandate and all arms of state to be able to pull in the same direction, we're always going to be in this place where the public is disenfranchised by politicians saying something and not delivering on it.
Are some of these arm's length bodies, regulatory agencies, quangos, whatever we want to call them, are they generating regulation in order to perpetuate their own bureaucratic empires, Ben Houchen?
Well, all arm's length government bodies have to justify their own existence because they will be criticised, I'm sure, by you, Liam, and other journalists to say, well, what are you there to do? And why did you stop that instead of approving it? It's led to me over the last 6 or 7 years to start to go on a journey of looking, if we're going to have these arm's length government bodies, and there's a question as to whether we need them or not, or do they get absorbed back into the departments? But if we're going to have them, I'm increasingly of the view that we need directly politically appointed people into the chairmanship and the chief executive roles of these government arm's length bodies, because you've got to allow the culture of that organisation to be in lockstep with what the government's trying to do, which are elected by the people, which is what a democracy is all about. If you don't have that joined up thinking, then under this government, Keir Starmer can promise growth all he likes, but the arm's length government bodies are going to say, well, hang on a little minute, I have this priority and growth isn't it. So we're not going to do it. And things like, I could go back to it, things like the Environment Agency are a great example of that. And there is a place where I think this government could get itself to, where it could try and change things within the Environment Agency, but they'll get pillared by the journalists and the Tory party saying you're lowering environmental standards to try and meet your growth goals. And actually, the reality of some of the changes that they should make won't actually impact environmental standards whatsoever. But the Environment Agency will use that politically to try and stop that type of progress. So there's a real battle to have if this government wants to deliver its growth agenda with all arm's length government bodies, not just the Environment Agency.
How will the election of Donald Trump, the re-election of Donald Trump, change British politics? Is it an opportunity for the Conservative Party, for your party?
I think it is in the medium term. I think Donald Trump coming in will signify, not just to the UK, but a lot of the Western world, that there is a different way of being able to do politics. And I think in quite a positive way. I think just in the last couple of days, people will have seen, there were flights blocked for illegal immigrants to go back to Colombia. Within an hour, Donald Trump had threatened tariffs, and if you're not going to take them back, there are going to be penalties to the way you're going to behave. You're not going to take your own nationals back. We're going to retaliate. Within an hour, they'd reversed that, and the president of Colombia had actually offered his own plane to bring them back. Now, people may agree or disagree with that. The people I've spoken to on the street who've seen that in the last couple of days think, why aren't we more like that? So I think what it will do is it will start to move, where politics lies. It will move that Overton window more to the right, where in the medium term, the Conservative Party could use that to say, actually, there's a different way of doing politics in the UK as well. We don't have to be technocratic. We don't have to be led by a massive blob and a bureaucracy. Actually, there is a sensible centre-right way of delivering good small government, reducing taxes, growing the economy, and actually be able to leverage on some of the things that I think Trump will end up doing over the next 4 years. Not saying copy and paste, right? Trump and America are a pretty unique proposition, but there are lessons to be learned there that Conservatives can take and also point to with the electorate to say, there's a big opportunity here. If you vote for us, centre-right politics, this is what we do. The future can be a bright one for Britain.
Before we move on to domestic politics, of course, as Teesside Mayor, you grew up with the steel industry, the blast furnace at Redcar, which now has unfortunately been turned off. We've seen the blast furnace turned off at Port Talbot. I think there's one or two blast furnaces now operating in the UK at Scunthorpe, a largely Chinese-owned factory, of course. Does it bother you that the UK can no longer produce what we call virgin steel from a blast furnace, the kind of steel that you need for certain defence and construction applications that we now have to import?
Well, the last remnants of a steel industry in the UK is British Steel in Scunthorpe. It's the only place that is producing what you call primary steel, which is essential not just to maintaining our railways, building buildings, but our national security. Having a steel industry, no developed Western economy does not have its own steel industry. The world is a dangerous place. It's getting more dangerous. Having that domestic capability in the supply chain to build our ships, to build our submarines, is essential. If British Steel closes, then we are at the whims of the global markets, which are largely dictated to by the Chinese. The Chinese currently own British Steel. And the biggest thing that went wrong in recent months was Port Talbot being allowed to close. And it was closed. The government had given a huge amount of support that may or may not come to fruition, not because the government haven't given it, but it may or may not be utilised. But what it did is it sent a signal to the Chinese and British Steel that they could still get a load of money out of government. They could lay off thousands of people. And the big thing that the government allowed them to do in South Wales, because it's owned by Tata, an Indian company, it allowed the Indians to import steel from India. And so the Chinese are looking, thinking, hang on, I can close down this steelworks, get a load of government support, and for what? At least the next 5, 6, 7 years, import cheap Chinese steel from my operations in China that's environmentally very damaging, health and safety is through the floor, it's cheap as anything. you're always going to get to a place, if British Steel closes, there's a real risk that we never have a steel industry again because we can't deal with those types of imports. Now, the only alternative to that would be introducing tariffs for imports, which would drive up the price, as you well know, Liam, and then you all of a sudden get into a spiral. So I actually think it's pretty essential to the economy, never mind the politics of today, that we have to maintain an indigenous steel industry because the future could be a very dangerous one. And I personally think, there is a lot of geopolitics going on with British Steel being owned by the Chinese, because if you're the Chinese, who I do not think is a friend of the UK or the West more generally, if you're them and you think, hang on, I can close down steelmaking in the UK, make them a whim basically to Chinese dumping on the international markets, that's a huge geopolitical win for the Chinese. So I think we've got to be really careful about this. And I've actually said to Johnny Reynolds, the Secretary of State, on this, if it gets to it, and as a Conservative, it's not something I like to do, but we may need to look at things like the Civil Contingencies Act to take it off them to keep it. That's how serious this matter is, and I really worry.
That would be a huge step.
I mean, but they have to do it. What's the alternative? We don't have steel making anymore, and then all of a sudden it's all from India and China. What does that do to, like I say, public security, national security? What does it do for our industry? It's a really, really big issue. I worry at the minute that there is a way through that we can keep British Steel open. We can build new steel plants in the UK. We can reshore manufacturing and create jobs in the UK in manufacturing. But it requires a strong government, and it particularly requires a strong government that doesn't play politics with this, about its location. There's a lot of talk about Scunthorpe. They want it to go to Scunthorpe because of the politics. And there's a lot of union involvement here as well. The unions are definitely pulling the strings behind the scenes. And I've written to the unions to try and work with them on it. You know, they wouldn't be natural bedfellows, but I published an open letter and said, I want to work with you on this. This is important. I got a letter back from the three general secretaries of Community, Unite, and the GMB, who all said they didn't want to work with me. You know, that's the position we find ourselves in, with unions pulling the strings of this government, not wanting to work with local communities who are steeped in steel to try and protect our steel industry. We could very quickly find ourselves without one and subject to some very, very pernicious players on the international market that would put us at major risk in the medium term.
Final question, Ben. You are one of very few senior Conservatives actually with power in the country at the moment. There is a lot of speculation, despite your work as Teesside Mayor, that in the not-too-distant future you want to get more involved with national politics. What would you be doing if you were the leader of the Conservative Party now that Kemi Badenoch isn't doing?
I mean, I've said this before. I think the big part of Kemi's job is to help the public understand that the Conservative Party is under new management and that we are the Conservative Party that they've traditionally trusted. You know, we are of sound money. We are common sense on things like immigration. We're common sense on the economy. We're common sense on cultural matters, you know, whether that's, you know, DEI or wokeism or whatever you want to brand it as. And it's going to be hard fought. And so we need to be out there much more. We need to be on TV screens every single day, helping people understand that we get it. We get where we got it horribly wrong. Apologise actually for some of the mistakes or some of the big mistakes we made, certainly over the last 3 or 4 years, so that people understand that we genuinely understand that. We're not paying lip service to it. But help people understand that that's not what this Conservative's about anymore. We've learned from those mistakes. There are new people in charge. There's a brighter future ahead. And start to draw some comparisons of where I think this government's going quite badly wrong and what we would do in the future. Now, that's not a policy point. That's not about announcing what you're going to change of, you know, this tax code or, you know, these migration rules. But it's about giving a sense of direction to the country, that we get it, we understand it, and with a Conservative government, this country will be better off.
Does your party at the highest level really get the threat that reform poses?
I think so. I hope so. I know there are lots of people, including myself, talking to the Conservative Party about this, because one of the things that, particularly being in a place like Teesside that's very red wall, it's not like it was in the early 2000s where, you know, if Labour were doing well, we were doing poorly, or, you know, where Labour were doing badly, we would automatically do well. You know, in 2019, it was very one way. You know, there was a lot of swing to the Conservative Party. With this election in 2024, what we've seen is the same thing happen in, you know, Tory heartlands rather than the red wall. And what it did, and I can tell you this from experience in the red wall, it's now broken that traditional link between Conservative voters and the Conservative Party, like the red wall did with Labour in 2019. That now means that there's a huge space in the middle for Nigel Farage. He's very popular. He is. People might not like it, but he's very popular. He's very succinct. He's very clear in how he communicates. He's very common sense. In a world where people feel let down, they feel like they're not being listened to. They feel like the direction of the country and their communities is not where they want to go. And they see a Labour Party that's not performing well. They still see the Conservatives as basically just being the same because of look at what we've done over the last few years. And you have a man in the middle that's promising quite simplistic but quite clear messages to the country. We need to combat that. We need to be able to get there first because, to be frank, a lot of what Nigel's saying are quite conservative things. We should be saying them. We should be saying them first, and we should be adopting that so the public come back to us.
Could he be the next Prime Minister?
Nigel Farage, I don't think so. I mean, obviously he could, but I think it's extremely unlikely. I don't think he can. I think the maturity of the systems within reform will not be there in time. I think they're also on a bit of a honeymoon themselves as being the third party, as not being tarnished like the Conservative Party and not doing the things that this government is doing. So they're getting a relatively easy ride. There's a really interesting thing going on in reform between quite a protectionist, relatively left-wing economic policy and those that don't sit naturally with your Richard Tices and your Nigel Farages, who are free market Tories at the end of the day. And so if there was a momentum... Well, Rupert Lowe, exactly. And others actually not within the parliamentary party. And so there will be a reckoning at some point where reform is going to have to pick a lane. It can't do both of those things. Now, can they ride two horses for a while longer? Of course they can, because the country's not really listening to the politics of opposition parties. They hear things in general from day to day, week to week, month to month about politics, but they're not in it. But in 2 or 3 years' time, when elections start to roll around and people start to get serious about what do they want for the country and who do they want to run it, I'm not sure that that reform can do what it's doing today in a serious way that it will have to do in 3 or 4 years' time.
Ben Houchen, thanks a lot for appearing on Planet Normal.
Pleasure.